Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for your patience. We had a little technical glitch to solve, but as they say, with performance, the show must go on. So I'm Josh Heumann, the Curator of Education and Public Programs at the Power Plant. Before we begin, the Power Plant would like to acknowledge the traditional keepers of the land on which it was built, the Mississaugas of the New Credit and the Six Nations of the Grand River, Huron-Wendat, Métis, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and any other nations who cared for the land, acknowledged and unacknowledged, recorded and unrecorded. So welcome to this evening's International Lecture Series program featuring Valerie Cassel Oliver, Senior Curator, Contemporary Arts Museum, Houston, speaking on Funk Lessons, Black Performance in Contemporary Art. We recognize our primary education sponsor, CIBC, for their generous support of all education and public programs at the Power Plant. We also thank our institutional supporters, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Ontario Arts Council, and the Toronto Arts Council. And finally, we are grateful to BMO for all year, all free, which allows free year-round access to the gallery. Of course, we also thank some of you who are members who receive free tickets to almost every one of our public programs, and also invitations to members-only programs. So if you're not yet a member and you like what the Power Plant has been doing, please consider becoming a member of the Power Plant. We'd love to welcome you. So turning to tonight, the International Lecture Series is a long-running program of talks by high-profile artists, curators, and cultural commentators from around the world. So this evening, we're pleased to welcome Valerie Cassel Oliver, who will intentionally, or perhaps unintentionally, provide a broader historical context for one of the Power Plant's current exhibitions, Kapwani Kiwanga, A Wall is Just a Wall, or more apropos, her performance on April 21st, presented in collaboration with Images Festival of Kapwani Kiwanga's Afro-Galactica, A Brief History of the Future. So Valerie seemed the perfect speaker based on her groundbreaking exhibition, as you can see on the screen, Radical Presence, Black Performance in Contemporary Art. The exhibition and its accompanying catalog provided a critical framework for discourse about and expansion of the canon around performance art and the contributions of Black artists since the 1960s to its pervasiveness in contemporary art practice. The exhibition featured work by 3 generations, an incredibly long list of artists, including Terry Adkins, Coco Fusco, David Hammond, Caleb Lindsay, Adrian Piper, Dred Scott, and more. It's really an astounding exhibition, which I saw in Houston. In addition to Radical Presence, Cassel Oliver has organized numerous other exhibitions, including the acclaimed Double Consciousness, Black Conceptual Art since 1970 in 2005, a remarkable Trenton Doyle Hancock survey exhibition in 2014, and currently she's working on an exhibition entitled Annabeth Rosen, Fired, Broken, Gathered, Heaped, which will open at the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston in August of 2017. Prior to working in Houston, she was director of the Visiting Artist Program at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, for which she now serves as a Senior Curatorial Fellow in the Advanced Curatorial Practices Seminar and Practicum. Among numerous honors, in 2000 she was one of 6 curators selected to organize the biennial for the Whitney Museum of American Art, and more recently, in 2016, she was awarded the Carol and Arthur Goldberg Foundation to Life Visiting Curator Fellowship at Hunter College. So for now, please welcome Valerie Cassel Oliver.
Well, thank you so much, Josh, for inviting me here, and thank you all for being here. Thank you for your patience, too. It's nothing like performance, and we like to include our audiences in the performance. I'm here to talk about Radical, and not so much the entirety of the exhibition. I wanted to focus on only a few, but before, I'll just sort of set up the context for it. Radical began, or it rather emerged out of numerous conversations. As Josh mentioned, I worked at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and a number of artists came through the institution, namely Clifford Owens. He did his undergraduate work there in photography. And we developed a relationship there, which was really based on very long and overwrought, sporadic conversations. And one of the things that Clifford, who eventually went to Rutgers, he knew I was working on a Ben Patterson retrospective, which was done in 2010. But at the time, I had received a Getty Research Fellowship to work on it. And he was aware of it because Jeff Hendricks was one of his professors at Rutgers and really kept the whole idea of the Fluxus constellation and the impetus of Fluxus and its history alive through his teachings at Rutgers. And Clifford and I would speak constantly. He would say, Valerie, where are we in this canon? Where can I see myself reflected? Because even though he was coming out of undergraduate work in photography at Rutgers, he had studied performance and integrating those two things. So one of the things that set Radical apart for me, because there have been numerous exhibitions or projects around this notion of performance and Black performance, but very few, if any, really focus on visual arts engaged in performance. So for me, it was imperative, having worked with objects, that the artists engaged in Radical were really working around this notion of object, whether the object was created through performance, whether it was, and as such was a relic, whether performance really went into the creation of the work, like you'll see later in David Hammond's work, whether there were guerrilla performances that engaged audiences, and things were left behind, not necessarily relics, but basically objects in which the audience would engage in. These were things to me that were utmost important and really distinguished Radical from other projects that were dance-based or theater-based. That being said, a lot of the artists come to this from a variety of disciplines and genres, such as photography, and it's become more commonplace with the younger generation. But for the older generations, they came out of dance, as performance in general. When you look at someone like Joan Jonas, all of these artists have come from some place that performance became something rather new. It became a rather new discipline where visual artists were engaged in these sort of hybrid forms. So Clifford was questioning, where is the history? Where are we reflected as Black, African Americans, specifically African Americans? Where are we reflected in this canon? And knowing that Ben Patterson, for him, was a progenitor for this, Patterson, for those who are not aware of him, was one of the co-founders of Fluxus. And in many publications, he's really not always featured, which to me is a rather distorted view of history, because he was there at the very inception of Fluxus, and he and Machunas actually, and Emmett Williams actually organized the first festival of new music, which happened in Wiesbaden. He studied music, composition, and performance on the double bass, and was very well into his work as a classical basis, of course, working in Canada, because when he came out of school at the University of Michigan in the 1950s, the U.S. orchestras and symphonies were segregated, and there was no place for him. So he came to Halifax and worked as first chair and as conductor. And it wasn't until he was conscripted in the U.S. Army, which was very ironic, that he went to Europe and was very curious about the sort of elasticity of music and where new music was going. Even in the classical realm, he was already looking at experimentations. So even though he was really more or less focused on performance and music and performative music, he was already writing scores for sound. So in 1958, he wrote a letter home to his family, which became Paper Piece, which was a activity, since he was not able to come home, for his family, that they could all take the wrapping paper from their Christmas presents, and someone could shake it, someone could fold one, the other person could crumble. So it was a beautiful piece that with ordinary objects you could create sound, and that was one of the first scores that he created. This particular work, William Pearson is in the background. He was a baritone singer, classical singer, and in this one is called Collage for Lemons, which was a piece from 1960. This is a restaging of Septet from Lemons, which was also a very early work. Of course, there's Emmett Williams here as well. So you see on the far, I guess it would be it's my far left, your far right. And this is a piece that we actually featured in the exhibition called Pond. And later on in the presentation, I'll actually show you a video from it. But also, these notions of the score as object. So in Radical, again, where the preponderance is on the object, objects such as even scores were very much a part of the exhibition. So this notion of documentation, this becomes one of many elements of objects that are featured in the exhibition. So and Clifford and I actually ended up working on his first solo museum exhibition, which overlapped with the Patterson retrospective, which was a sort of beautiful confluence of those generations coming together. But there was also this other generation that sat in between the two, and this would be the generation of someone like David Hammond. And here, again, the performative element coming to create the object. Here, this is a series of body prints that he started in the late 1960s, 1968, and this would be one of the results of them. And so even though this performance happened within the studio, to me it was still very much appropriate to include it into the exhibition, because we were looking at objects also out of actions. This is called Power to the Spade, which oftentimes in the U.S., the word spade was often used as a derogatory language to refer to black people. So this notion of empowering something which is ordinarily a very derogatory term. And here's Hammond's in the early 1980s with the Blizzard Ball Sale. The photograph and documentation of that was by Dawood Bey, photographer. And here, this notion of being out into the world and the idea of the absurdity of selling snowballs after a blizzard. And this was in Tompkins Square in New York City. Also Adrian Piper. So there were some artists, black artists, who were already gaining wide range of recognition because of their work and performance. Hammond's being one, but certainly someone like Adrian Piper. And these are stills taken from documentation that Peter Kennedy created called Art Other Than Art's Sake. And this one was Becoming the Mythic Being. And so this notion as the body as mutable, where she would go from, the lovely Adrian Piper, to what she considered this male body, this embodiment of maleness, in which she would walk down the street. And while she would walk down the street, she would recite grocery lists. Her mother would write these grocery lists, and sometimes she would go and help her mom to secure these groceries. And so she would keep these, she would remember them, and just literally talk to herself walking down the street. And it was this idea about the embodiment of how the body is perceived, female versus male. Female with fair skin and long hair versus what could be perceived as a Puerto Rican or Latino male walking down the street, which would give a totally different perception to those encountering. This was, of course, the Adrian Piper funk lessons. So beyond this idea of transforming the body, it was also engaging people, allowing the body to become a tool in which to engage other people to understand the notion of funk, which, has its deep roots in the States as being an outgrowth of the blues, and the blues being an outgrowth of the field hollers, of gospel and spirituals being an outgrowth of field hollers. And so it all goes back to moments and histories regarding chattel slavery. So when you talk about funk, and that's why I'm part of the reason I wanted to entitle this Funk Lessons, because I really wanted to get to the point of understanding the body as being the complete embodiment of histories. And those histories are varied, but the bottom line is they all start at a focal point, particularly in the United States. They start with a focal point of chattel slavery. So I wanted to also expand this idea of radical presence to include artists from the Caribbean and Commonwealths, and this is an artist, Popel. So I'm sort of going generationally at this point. Popel, who this piece is called Superman 51. And so to his person, he's tied all of these 2x4s, and he's running down the West Side Highway in New York. This is 1977, and the idea was to protest the fact that Puerto Rico was not provided statehood, that it has then, as it is now, a Commonwealth of the United States. So it's something about this notion about performance and endurance that really moved me personally. And my essay in the catalog that accompanies this exhibition is called Putting Your Body on the Line. And it was about this notion of endurance and performance. This is Maren Hassinger performing with RSVP, which is a sculpture that Senga Ngudi had created, and their collaboration begins in the mid-1970s and continues even to today. And Maren also performed this piece beautifully throughout the run of Radical, which began at the Contemporary Arts Museum Houston in 2012 and traveled to New York in 2013, traveled to, and in New York into two sections, one at the Gray Art Gallery at NYU, and the other half was at the Studio Museum in Harlem. After that, it traveled to the Walker Art Center in 2014, where it stayed for about 6 months, and then one final venue was in San Francisco at the Yerba Buena Art Center. And in each case, those artists who activated the works came to each venue. So there was a tremendous commitment by those artists, and in many ways became also elements of endurance, because each of them also committed to doing the same works at each venue. So when you look at someone like Tamika Norris, who we'll look at momentarily, you'll see what kind of notion about the body and endurance comes into play. Also Lorraine O'Grady. These are ideas of works that happen over long periods of time. For her Mademoiselle, Bourgeois Noir, was a piece that she did from 1980 to 1983. For a 3-year period, she would create this persona and go out into the world. And part of it was, in the States in the 1980s, was a big push to see the diversity and equity being brought into mainstream museums. So her sense of creating this character is one who would go out and challenge these institutions to force herself within these institutions, because she was not being invited into these institutions. So she would show up and show out, as we say. So for the exhibition, we would have the cape. We had the cape and the crown and the gloves. And she oftentimes would craft these poems in which she would literally shout. So she would go to the openings and, of course, become spectacle. And then someone like Sherman Fleming, who this piece was from 1977, called Something Akin to Living. And these are all 2x4 pieces of wood. This is piece Something Akin to Living, and so here, the notion of endurance, of having these 2x4s wedged against the body, which is what was happening. People would come, as you can see in the image itself, and literally pick up these sticks and find ways to wedge it against his body until eventually it just falls apart. He walks away because it's pushed his body up to its own limits. And Sherman was one of because I lived in Washington, D.C., at the time he was known as Rod Force. And this notion about looking at black masculinity and taking that on and allowing his body to be vulnerable to all of the forces in which he could push it toward. So Rod Force, this is another work he did in the I had my notes, I had my prisoner notes, but so I'll just, I think this was done in 1993. It was a piece called Pretending to be Rock, and so there's an apparatus that's hanging above him, and he stays in this position. I believe the time I personally witnessed this performance, the time I saw it, it was a 2-hour piece, and he was there on all fours with this apparatus with numerous candles dripping wax down on his body. And so what you see is this sort of accumulation that's happening. Of course, William Popel, who becomes in many ways a grandmaster of endurance and performance work. Popel himself studied theater initially, but then quickly moved and had already been working primarily in experimental theater, but quickly moved into doing these sort of actions, both inside and outside of the white cube. This one is Eating the Wall Street Journal, which was done in 2000, and this is the piece that we actually featured in the exhibition. He didn't perform it because, he said, well, these newspapers, they use ink. It's very toxic. So, at some point, the other issue is with performance art, at some point, these are works that are no longer sustainable to continue to stage because things change, people's bodies change. There's just not the capability of doing them anymore, or restaging them. But for the purposes of the exhibition, we had the apparatus, the toilet and the tower that he sat on, and he came in and staged the scene as an installation. This one is Forging for Air, another piece. So you'll see this notion of really pressing the body. And Popel has this wonderful statement about performance art in general, and he says, I am white culture, but it's the Negro in me that makes me what I am. We can unpack that later. This is when I first really became aware of Popel, is through a series of crawl works that he began doing. This one is a piece he did in Tompkins Square. This is the first iteration of crawl. He subsequently would do them. He did one a version of it called The Great White Way, which I think was presented as part of the 2002 Whitney Biennial, where he crawled literally down Broadway, from lower Broadway all the way up Broadway. And he's done it in numerous cities around the world. He actually came to Houston. This was in 2001 with the fall of Enron, that he came and he crawled from Diverse Works, which is an alternative art center in Houston. He literally crawled from Diverse Works all the way to Enron. Jean-Ulrich Desert, who is actually from Haiti. He's born in Port-au-Prince and moved to New York and lived in New York, very much involved in doing actions and creating artwork in New York, but then decided to leave New York for Berlin. And he said it was the first time he actually felt othered in a way that made him deeply, deeply uncomfortable. So one of the projects he decided to do, he said, well, maybe if I allow Germans to see that I celebrate their culture, then they will embrace me differently. So he decided to purchase a lederhosen, which you can see, a pink, fleshy lederhosen, and he wore this lederhosen for 1 year. And this piece became Negerhosen 2000. So we have him, and he, of course, would document himself in all varied, situations, putting his body out into the world. And he would create these postcards. So what he would do is take a photo or have people take photos of him, and then he would ask them, he would give them an envelope, and he would ask them to mail the printed photo back to him. So what we had was a whole series of these postcards, Negerhosen 2000 postcards. And of course, it's his note that he writes about this particular interaction that he has. If you want to read them, I can slow down. So he said, the photographer pressed me, and I was asked if I would be so kind as to have a moment with the Bavarian guests of the fair's organizers. They were all very proper, he writes. So the other project was one by Leonardo. And one of the things that I loved about Radical is that at each subsequent venue it went to, depending on the venue, because the Contemporary Arts Museum is a non-collecting institution, but say when it went to the Studio Museum, which is a collecting institution, they had works by some of the artists in the exhibition and asked, could we consider putting some of our holdings and gauging the exhibition by including them, which of course I had no problem with. But also because we commission works, part of the idea of having the exhibition not be so document laden and dead is that it would have a series of actions constantly energizing the space, both inside and outside of the space. For Leonardo, we commissioned him to do a work called The Arena. So while we had a video of the work, this is El Conquistador versus the Invisible Man, which is a series, it was a compilation that we did, a series of these performances that he did, wrestling with himself, basically. That at each venue also, he was commissioned to do new works. So I also want to show you, I don't know if I can do it now, a piece that he did at Yoruba, which was called Eulogy. And it sort of gets at the heart of this notion of the black body. And for him, being Dominican, there is very interesting history about, because Dominican Republic shares the same landmass with Haiti, where the dictator Rafael Leonardo, someone help me here. I'm totally blanking on his name. This is why I have notes, people.
From Haiti,
No, from the Dominican. Trujillo, thank you, Rafael Trujillo. In the 30s, actually, there was a moment, of course, which was called the Parsley Massacres. It was in early October 1937, where it really killed many, many Haitians to really create this a border, a psychological border as well. And so the impact that it then had on Dominicans was this notion of almost purging blackness in a very strange way. And so for Jean Leonardo, that is a sort of psyche that continued even into his generation. So this idea of fighting this duality, of fighting El Conquistador versus the invisible man, was really taking this notion of what had happened historically and looking at the psychological ramifications that it had even on subsequent generations, what they deal with psychically, not psychically, within their own person, within their own bodies. What does it mean to be a black Dominican? There's no such thing, you're Dominican. So for him, that was the whole premise of the piece, which was very intensely physical. So he literally is hurling himself on the ground, is literally wrestling with himself in the most visceral ways. So, but what he did and I'm afraid to touch this, but I'm going to do it anyway, because I think it's really beautiful. What he did for Yoruba was to do a piece called Eulogy. And let's see if we can get to it.
What are you waiting for me to tell you? What good will it do? What if I told you that this isn't a funeral? That it's a holiday celebration, that if you stick around, the band will end up playing, damn it to hell, the fun's all over. Or do you expect to see some magic? The dead rise up and walk again? Go home. Forget him. He's as dead as he'll ever die. That's the end and the beginning, and there is no encore. There'll be no miracles, and there's no one here to preach a sermon. Go home. Forget him. He's in this box, newly dead. Go home and don't think about him. He's dead. And you've got all you can do to think about you. I told you to go home, but you keep standing there. Don't you know it's a little cold out here? So what if you wait for what little I can tell you? Can I tell you in 20 minutes what took 21 years to build and ended in 20 seconds? Why wait for more when all I can tell you is his name? And once I've told you, what else will you know except perhaps his name? All right? All right. You do the listening, and I'll try to do the telling. Then you go home and forget it. Forget it. His name was Oscar Grant, and they shot him. His name was Michael Brown, and he was tall. And some folks thought him handsome. And although he didn't believe it, I think he was. His name was Eric Garner, and his face was black, and his hair was thin and tight rolled curls. You can call them naps or kinks. He's dead.
So I'll stop there. I think you get the gist of it. And a lot of these, even from the Contemporary Arts Museum and even the subsequent venues, all the performances were recorded. And so you can easily go to YouTube and put in Radical and watch all of these at your leisure. But one of the significant things that happened during the run of the exhibition from 2012, of course, to the time that it closed in at Yoruba was, of course, this rash of murders that were taking place. Oscar Grant, of course, was really, not really the first, but probably the most, especially in San Francisco, the artist, not the artist, good Lord, the individual who was murdered at the hands of the MTA police, Metro Transit Police, where he was shot. Again? Did you do it again? Okay. Then the system. Okay. What I will say is this. Even in 2016, the Huffington Post declared that close to 258 black men and women had been murdered at the hands of police. So this is a real issue in the United States. I know Black Lives Matter is a big movement, which also extends all the way to Canada, if I'm correct? Yes. Yeah. So one of the things that a Radical just happened to be there, I will say. It was a wonderful vehicle of talking about this notion of lure and loathing. What is it about this pathology, this sense of hatred against black bodies? And so the exhibition really became a way through the artist's work. Some artists' work were about that, but oftentimes it was not about that at all. And the notion that there were 3 generations of artists, this idea and issues that they had to speak of really shifted in each successive generation. But it is still this idea of this history that is carried within the black body that was still at the heart of it. And so it happened to beautifully dovetail at each point, at each venue, where it became a way of really having these very frank conversations. And so for Sean Leonardo, we commissioned him to do a piece called The Arena, which also had this sort of a small constellation of musicians that worked with him, very much like you see here in San Francisco. MJ's Big Boppers was the name of the band that played with him. And so it had the same sensibility, except Eulogy was so pointed, at that point. By 2015, you did have these very, very high profile, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, those that happened in 2014, and it was the intensity and the debate around why this was occurring was really at a peak at that time. It's since it still continues, of course. But so creating Eulogy was something which happened only at Yoruba, and it happened because of the openness of all these venues that took the show to really continue to allow the exhibition to evolve with the same artists, the same core group of artists. So I think that's what gave it such strong resonance out into the world. This is Dred Scott, and a series that he did this is what was presented in the exhibition, which was an Untitled series, but clearly riffing on time and on history. The Memphis, Tennessee sanitation workers strike in 1968 was the reason Martin Luther King was in Tennessee when he was assassinated. It became, there's a very iconic, beautiful iconic image by Ernest Withers, a photographer, who really took the photos of this sanitation workers strike. And of course, they all had these cards, these posters that they wore around their necks that said, "I am a man." So Dred Scott is really a provocateur, par none. And so walking through the streets of Harlem as a black man, of course, dressed to really evoke this 1960 sensibility and time, where he's walking through the streets of Harlem with this poster, "I am not a man." So he really, did I skip over? Okay. He really comes to prominence when he's a student at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago with this project that he did, The Proper Way to Display an American Flag. And he has this wonderful statement that he said, "They denounced my work on the floor of the Senate as they passed legislation, and President Bush publicly said that he thought the work was disgraceful. So here I am, 24 years old, and the President of the United States knows I exist and doesn't like what I'm doing. And I think I must be doing something right. This is really good." So this is his statement. And of course, this idea of Dred Scott, Dred Scott, of course, was a slave who had been brought into freedom by his master and wanted and sued to remain free because he was brought into free territory, but then was returned back into slavery. So this notion of even calling himself Dred Scott already politicizes this notion of the black body throughout history. So this is more images from his the Untitled work. And of course, he's confronted because, at one point, there's this total amnesia about history. How many people know about the sanitation workers strike from 1968? But then there's also this idea that you're walking around with this placard saying, "I am not a man." So it's kind of speaking back to this notion about current conversations. What does it mean to be a man? Where does the spaces of fluidity, and how does the public respond to that? Oftentimes in very strange and unpredictable ways. Some people found it humorous, some people were upset about it. But again, it's this notion of putting one's body on the line to be out in the world in this very a way that provokes some sort of conversation to take place. And this is a piece that he recently did, also in response to the sort of acts of genocide against black men. And it's got a beautiful poetic title, which I don't want to mess up. It's called "On the Impossibility of Freedom in a Country Founded on Slavery and Genocide." And this is a piece he did in 2014, where, of course, part of the civil rights, the resistance to a lot of protesters during the civil rights was to put these hoses onto the protesters. And so here he is subjecting his body to the same sort of adverse conditions that were enacted upon black bodies only 50 years prior. Of course, and then there's, where's my timer? Am I doing okay on time? You guys okay? Okay. And so then there's Tamika Norris, who also did this piece, which is called Untitled. Initially, she did it, she went to school at UCLA and then ended up at Yale in the painting department. And because of her, sort of, I don't know, leanings toward performance, she was really taken to task in a lot of the critiques. Rob Storr at the time was the chair of the department, and really chided her for not creating paintings. So she said, okay. Initially, when this was first presented, it was called Untitled for Rob Storr. And it's where she literally pierces her tongue and then with her own blood and saliva creates a painting onto the wall itself. So this is a piece which she did not only in Houston, but also in New York, and also in Minneapolis, and also in San Francisco. So really putting one's body on the line. And she did tell me that she was retiring the piece after the exhibition. So you'll only see it in stills and video. And in doing the piece, there are a number of performances that are happening simultaneously. When we presented it in Houston, it was part of the opening weekend activities, and that followed through each subsequent venue. And so there is a large crowd that's there, and as in that first image, where she sort of implicates the people who were there as being witness to her own adverse actions against her own body for the sake of art. So there's a very uncomfortable feeling. It's as much about her performing as well as those who are watching the performance. And so this piece stays up throughout the run of the exhibition, of course. So Clifford Owens, I mentioned him earlier, sort of being the sort of provocateur to get me thinking about how I might bring visibility to this history. I mentioned before that he had contacted all these artists to write scores for him. So what we presented was a sort of a selection of those scores, which he then performed and captured in photography. This is one by Nsenga Knight, Senga Ngudi. This was a score written for him by Kara Walker. And prior to that, he had been doing a series of actions with audiences. These is from a series called Photographs with an Audience, which we showed in Houston as part of his solo exhibition, but it was also gives you a sort of inroad to how performance and photography intersect, and how, in particular, he was using it to also work with audience members. So he would oftentimes give the audience instructions of something to do, and then he would insert himself into that and then have someone photograph it. This was actually taken in Houston. So Zavera Simmons is another artist who's featured, and this particular piece she did in 2013 when she was in residence in Sri Lanka. And of course, she boards this train knowing full well that the customs in Sri Lanka are really meant to be women are to be very modest. And so being an other meant being from the West, basically, and not really observing the social customs there in Sri Lanka. So aboard the train, she decided to do this action, which started as people really distancing themselves from her, and really comes in with people actually engaging and helping her. So she initially comes on the train dressed as you see her, and then over a course of 53 frames, find people not only looking at her as spectacle, but actually helping her as she begins to cover herself and cover her body. To the point where there's so many clothing on her, she's like this. But she finds that the people who were initially sort of shunning her and othering her suddenly become her helpers. So I just wanted to show just how this exhibition existed. This was the installation in Houston. So part of the thing that I felt challenged by as a curator was how to make the exhibition active, how to make it dynamic, how not to make it be about documentation objects, but to actually make it function and reverberate with actions. So these are simple installation shots, and this was the opening weekend. This is Terry Atkins in the Lone Wolf Recital Houston edition, where he came and actually gave a sort of, not a processional, but the sort of invocation to the entire exhibition with the last trumpet performance. Popel, in addition to the Eating the Wall Street Journal, piece, installation, also, we commissioned him to do a new work called Costume Made of Nothing, and you could see someone activating the piece. This piece also evolved over time and over the various venues. Maren Hassinger, again, activating the Singin' and Goody work. Tamika Norris. This one was called Texas Fried Tenor, in which Jamal Cyrus literally coded and prepared a tenor saxophone to be fried. And then Trenton Doyle Hancock with his piece called Devotion. Again, Zavera Simmons, The Color of Moon is this work. And then Jacoby Satterwhite. So they would come and activate the works, and then they would then sit on view this piece with Jacoby with the iPad and iTouch that you can activate that would actually show what would be playing on these devices while he was performing, but then also playback, also the documentation of the performance itself. This is at the Gray Art Gallery when it was in New York, at the Studio Museum in Harlem. You can see here, lovely, they had a whole calendar of events and actions that would take place. That was part of the vinyl presentation. This was Costume Made of Nothing. So over the course of time, and this is at the Walker, Popel took the piece away from the wall, and it became a standing sculpture in and of itself in which a performer would then interface with. Maren Hassinger, this is also at the Walker. And I think that is it. So thank you so much. I had one from Yoruba, but it's okay. Thank you. Oh, you guys are troopers. Thank you so much. So, any more questions? Any more comments now that you've seen the whole kit and caboodle? Well, not everything, but I focused on a few artists, but...
So in New York City, the exhibition was divided between two venues.
Yes.
So how was,
No.
How was it determined which works would go to which venue?
Well, for the Gray Art Gallery, we wanted to focus on the older artists, older generations of artists. So the exhibition was a bit staggered in New York. So it opened at the Gray Art Gallery. They had to really craft the timing to sync with the semester. So it opened in like late August, early September at the Gray Art Gallery. And because they wanted to use it primarily for instructional purposes, we situated a lot of the older artists there at the Gray Art Gallery, and then allowed the younger artists to then be featured at the Studio Museum, which opened like in November. So it was almost like a 2-month stagger. Yes?
Could you say more about participation as a strategy throughout? And I was thinking particularly of how from some of the earlier artists, art is by Lorena Ray,
Yes.
Being a kind of really important sort of precedent, and how that sort of resonates in some of the younger artists.
Yes, so Lorraine O'Grady, we did have Mademoiselle de Bourgeois Noir, but when it came to the Studio Museum, because they owned Art Is, which was a project she did where she got money from the city to host a parade in Harlem, and she had a float, and she had all of these volunteers who would dress in white, who would then frame the audience, the people in Harlem, within frames, and then document it with photography. So Art Is became a series of photographs which showed the faces of the people who lived in the neighborhood. So this active engagement, definitely, there's a Dave McKenzie work which is called While Supplies Last, which was a basic bobblehead of Dave McKenzie, and so people would come and he would offer them the bobbleheads. There were several artists who really did these sort of performative works which engaged the public. Patterson himself did a work, Beyond Pond, which was called Penny for Your Thought, in which you could sell your old thoughts and he would give you new thoughts for a penny. So there were a number of artists within the sort of constellation of the artists featured that would do these sort of actions of engagement. Unrequited was another piece which came into the Walker presentation, which was the Popel piece, in which people actually were charged to read different parts of a 72-part series that he had written. So there was, and even the RSVP, which is the Senga Ngudi, Maren Hassinger piece, oftentimes the audience were given bells or other items in which to create a sort of composition while Maren would be performing RSVP. So that engagement happened, and it, again, with each successive venue, it allowed the artists to think even greater, and they could come to the table with different ideas. Every institution was amazingly generous in allowing this sort of, very fluid. I mean, it was the core of the exhibition was always there, but there would be little things here and there. Artists would want to come and experiment and explore. One of the things that happened, which was not anticipated, was the death of Terry Atkins. And there was my own conundrum: how do I then represent his work when the artist is now no longer with us? We were very fortunate because Terry had mentored so many artists. He taught at the University of Pennsylvania, and people like Demetrius Oliver went there. Jamal Cyrus, who did the Texas Fried Tenor piece, also studied under Terry. Jacoby Satterwhite. So he had mentored so many people. So with the permission of his wife and of the gallery, we were able to continue the work of The Last Trumpet, allowing Jamal to then activate the piece with local iterations of groups to activate it. So, yeah. Okay. Anyone else? Yes. Yeah.
You can see the overlap in your research through double consciousness to cinema remix, reloaded to radical.
Wow.
To radical presence.
Well, aren't you the one? You know my projects, don't you?
Yeah, I followed your work a bit, yeah.
Yes.
But I was curious if you could speak to where this research could take your next project, because, I mean, since you produced Radical Presence, there's been an increased focus on dance and theater, and it was interesting you made that distinction between artists working in a visual art modalities or idioms versus theater or dance tradition, but there's even more overlap now in institutions, so I was wondering if that would be one potential place that I have in my mind, or if you have another place that this kind of, these threads of this very body-centered curatorial research you've been doing through those three shows, where that would take you next for a kind of survey or group show.
Well, Yes, there is another group show. I'm not really prepared to talk about it. That's formulating. I sort of took a bit of a break in a way, but I mean, right now I'm working with Naomi Beckwith at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Howardina Pindell retrospective. And it's not so much about the bodily elements, or, it's a slightly different thing altogether. I've sort of veered into the path of painting and abstract painting, and I've been sort of there for the past few years. So that's kind of where I've been digging deep as of late. But there's a project on the horizon for 2020, hindsight, and it's coming, but it will have a lot to do with performance. And they do. Each project does inform the other. And it's not just within those three, because between, I would say, Double Consciousness and Cinema Remixed and Reloaded, there was Hand Plus Made, which was all about craft and performance. And craft and performance actually provided more of a bedrock for understanding radical and what it could be, rather than the other exhibitions. Patterson, certainly. But that was so heavy documentation, because a lot of it was scores and artist books, all things fluxes that you would expect, and objects, other visual objects that he created. But I would say Hand Plus Made gave me more or less the confidence to know that the project could really be dynamic and not very staid as a project around performance. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you so much.